In this video, we'll be answering the question, what are some of the fuels that can be used to produce ATP? So the first thing that you need to make sure that you know for this section is what the term bioenergetics means. So a bioenergetic pathway is the process by which we get ATP, or our usable form of energy, out of the foods that we eat. So basically you eat food, that food contains energy, that energy is getting transferred to some other form that the body can use, which is called ATP for the most part. There are a couple of other energy carriers that we'll discuss later on, but the big one is ATP. So the foods that can be used to produce ATP are lumped into three different categories. We have carbohydrates, which I'll abbreviate CHO. We have fats, which I'll abbreviate FAT, even though that's not really an abbreviation, I guess. And then we have proteins, which I'll abbreviate PRO in this section. So for the first fuel type, carbohydrates, you should know that carbohydrates tend to be categorized into three different groups. We have monosaccharides, which are just single sugar residues that are kind of floating around all by themselves in the body. We also have disaccharides, which are two sugar residues stuck to each other. And then we also have polysaccharides, which are three or more sugar residues stuck to one another. In this class, we'll focus on glucose, which you should know is a monosaccharide, and we'll also discuss glycogen pretty extensively. Glycogen is an example of what we call a polysaccharide. So if you've ever heard of somebody talking about blood sugar, they are talking about glucose in their blood. So you're probably already at least vaguely familiar with what glucose is. Glycogen might be a new term to use. So glycogen is the storage form of glucose. So a whole bunch of glucose residues get stuck to one another in this really intricate branched-like structure. And these glycogen molecules tend to live in the liver and the muscle. So that's where we store carbohydrate. It's also worth noting that glycogen can get broken down, and the process of glycogen breakdown is called glycogenolysis. So you'll notice at the end of this word glycogenolysis, you see the suffix lysis. Anytime you see lysis, that means breakdown. So glycogenolysis means we are breaking down glycogen. And when you break down glycogen, you get glucose. So glycogenolysis is the process of freeing glucose from its storage form, glycogen. Our second fuel type are fats. There are two types of fats that we'll focus on in this class. We have fatty acids or free fatty acids, which are abbreviated either FA for fatty acid or FFA for free fatty acid. These are the primary types of fat that we use for energy. Our second type of fat that you should be familiar with are triglycerides. Triglycerides are a storage form of fat, tend to be found in either adipose tissue or muscle. Most of the triglycerides are found in adipose tissue or your fat tissues. Triglycerides are a glycerol backbone with three fatty acids stuck to them. So when we're breaking down triglycerides, we're releasing those free fatty acids so that they can be used for fuel. And that process of breaking down triglycerides into free fatty acids or fatty acids is called lipolysis. So again, you see this lysis ending. That means that we are breaking down lipo. I don't know why they call fats lipo, but the way that I kind of remember what lipolysis means is I think of liposuction. So when you get liposuction, you're getting fat sucked out. The lipo for liposuction means fat, and the lipo for lipolysis means fat. It's also worth noting that lipolysis is going to be catalyzed by a group of enzymes called lipases. And this is another area where the ending of the word is important. So you see this ending ACE or ACEs, that indicates that we're talking about an enzyme. So a lipase is an enzyme that does something with fats. Finally, our third type of fuel, we have protein. Proteins, you should know, are made up of amino acids that are stuck together by peptide bonds. If you're going to use amino acids as an energy source, they need to be basically removed from the protein that they're a part of. So in order to use protein for fuel, you have to break it down into its amino acid subunits. And then these amino acids have to go through this pretty intricate process in order to get converted into a usable form. Some of them can get converted into glucose in the liver through a process called gluconeogenesis, or the synthesis of new glucose. Some amino acids can get converted into what are called metabolic intermediates. So these are little kind of like steps of the ATP production process. And if you get converted into one of the steps, you can ultimately be made into ATP. You don't really need to know in this class which amino acids can go through gluconeogenesis, or which amino acids can get converted into metabolic intermediates. You also don't need to know how those two things really occur, just know that they happen. It's also worth noting that we don't really talk about protein for its role in energy production all that much in exercise, because it really only contributes a very small amount of energy, or a really small amount of ATP to the overall amount of ATP that we use during exercise. So during normal exercise situations, only about 2% of the ATP that you get comes from proteins. And the contribution of proteins to ATP does increase as exercise duration goes on. So if you exercise for very, very, very long periods of time, you will see a little bit more protein being used for ATP production. But even at the end of very prolonged exercise, you're only getting about 5 to 10% of your overall ATP from proteins. So we mentioned proteins here, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not a huge player in ATP production.